Dr. Rick Serola, a chiropractor, and I'm discussing the Sacroiliac Nutation Lesion today, theory. So, the center of the sacroiliac joint is the center of motion in the body, the center of shock absorption, and the center of weight transfer. It's where the upper body meets the lower body. Shock absorption is something I'm going to just take off a little bit on. Our whole body is a contiguous shock absorber. The foot pronates or supinates. It's shock absorption and rebound. So the foot pronates and supinates. The knee internally rotates, the fibula, or the tibia rather, internally rotates relative to the femur on shock absorption. And then rebound, it externally rotates. The hips flex and extend. The sacroiliac joint goes into nutation and counternutation. The lumbar and cervical curves increase and then they flatten during rebound. Cranium. Now, Richard Gerardo was talking today about how the cranium participated in the same thing. The arch will either flatten or increase, depending on what phase it's going through. And we're concerned mostly today with the core, the structural core of the sacroiliac joint. It's right at where the sacrum and ilium counter-rotate. What happens is axial force comes down through the spine, and it causes the sacrum to drop anterior and inferior. And it also rotates, but I can't show that here two-dimensionally. The ground reaction force comes up through the legs and causes the pelvis, the ilium, to rotate posteriorly. So it's a counter-rotation between the upper body going anterior through the sacrum and the lower body going posterior through the ilium. What happens is it winds up the interosseous ligament and draws the ilium and sacrum closer together, but not together, because they're suspended by ligaments. All the ligaments, when they go, the lumbar curve will increase during nutation. Think again, it's shock absorption. And the nutation-resisting ligaments will become stressed, compromised, and then sprain. Then when it reaches, it'll be stressed at this point. So when it comes to the bottom point of nutation, all the force is absorbed by the ligaments, and then it springs back into counternutation. There's a reaction. The ligaments are causing the muscles. The ligaments become stressed, and they send a reaction to the muscles to rebound. Excess force, though, will cause the ligaments to become stressed. Overstressed, they compromise, overcompromised, and sprain. And so when these ligaments sprain, I call that the sacroiliac nutation lesion. That's just a local name for overall body shock absorption. This is when any shock absorbing joint becomes sprained, it then transfers that stress to other shock absorbing joints. So that's one mechanism of how this spreads throughout the entire body. You can have pronation, which will cause it'll go too far into pronation, and then it'll go so it goes too far into shock absorption, and that stresses the rest of the shock absorbing joints to try and resist that. Eventually, when that comes to the sacroiliac joint, the core, then the whole body is affected. The central spring becomes damaged. So ligaments regulate muscles, as in any joint. The ligaments within the joint, or that stabilize the joint, will regulate the muscles that attach to the bones that make up that joint. It's just a simple concept that's very easy to understand, except that most people don't understand it. We don't get to the point in our education where this is identified. In the back of our minds, we know that, yeah, that sounds true, but it's not really brought up in classes, or it's, you know. And there's a good reason for that. Now, first of all, just look at all these muscles. All these muscles either attach to the sacrum or innominate. That's the major portion of the whole musculoskeletal system. And again, when you have a ligament, the more ligaments that are involved in a reaction, the more muscles become involved. And here we have a large number of each. So it just makes sense when you look at that a sacroiliac sprain can affect the whole musculoskeletal system, even up to the cranium. Historically, the muscles have been disputed, the role of the muscles, because many years ago, the sacroiliac joint was thought not to move. And once it was proven to move, it still took decades for that information to filter down to the average clinician. Decades. At the time it wasn't thought to move, the muscles, of course, couldn't move it. So what they thought was that the muscles used the pelvis as an anchor to move the spine, the trunk, and the extremities. They didn't think the muscles could move. Now, the joint. So even after they proved that, there's still today anatomy books, most of them don't mention the movement of the SI joint by the muscles. They may show that it extends the pelvis, but they never show the relationship between the pelvis and the sacrum. It's affected by muscles. Top anatomists like Bogduk and Adams, and top teachers, groundbreaking teachers like Fred Mitchell Jr., they insist that the sacroiliac joint is not moved by muscles. They insist that it's moved by changes in body posture. The axial force comes down through the spine onto the sacrum and causes movement of the SI joint. It's stuff like this that makes treatment difficult. You know, it leads to a lot of false misconceptions. It leads to a lot of tangents and dead ends when we don't understand the basic biomechanics of what's happening in the body. The truth is, muscles move bones, ligaments regulate muscles that move bones, that make up the joint in which ligaments reside. And without that idea, then our treatment we can't visualize properly how everything integrates. So the goal of this lecture is to explain that the sacroiliac joint is a core, and how dysfunction at the sacroiliac joint will lead to dysfunction throughout the musculoskeletal system. So here we have the syndesmosis and the articular area. Syndesmosis is where the ligaments attach to the sacrum, and they go up and attach to the ilium. And they suspend the sacrum from the ilium, and the ilium hovers just superior and posterior to the sacrum. And this is the articular surface. It goes around the edges of the sacrum. If you could see here, the upper part faces backward and the lower part faces forward. So in effect, it rounds out the sacrum. The sacrum is thought to be a wedge by a lot of people because it's shaped like a wedge. But really, it's a cone. You just take a cone and you chop off the front and you chop off the back. And you have the rounded surfaces which guide the sacrum in its movement. So that's how it moves. So what happens, there's various, all these muscles that I've shown, wow. All these muscles that I've shown either attach to the sacrum and ilium or both in various attachment points, and they have various vectors to create either nutation or counternutation. You can take any single muscle and look at the motion that it creates, and it's either going to be nutation or counternutation. Those two motions reciprocate. Okay, so when the ligaments sprain, within the ligaments there are mechanoreceptors and nociceptors that activate a ligamental muscular reflex. It activates the muscles that cause cause counternutation and on the side of injury, and it inhibits the muscles that cause nutation because nutation is a lesion. It wants to avoid that. On the opposite side, because of the reciprocating motion, it activates the nutation muscles and inactivates the counternutation muscles. And by the way, the sacroiliac joint has been shown to have 97% of the proprioceptors are nociceptors, pain avoidance. So what's going on is, what this suggests that the primary action of the sacroiliac ligaments, the joint, is to avoid pain. Avoids pain first. The ligaments are protecting themselves, and they use the muscles to do it. Secondarily, they'll provide the motion. Okay, so the proprioceptive system is a vast neurological system. Involves the ligaments, they exchange information with other ligaments, muscles, tendons, fascia, skin, and higher centers in the brain. As Richard said earlier, 97% of the information going up to the brain is proprioception. And what it does is it regulates our position and movement of the body in space. But to avoid the injury, once we have the injury, it's going to try and avoid nutation on the site of injury. So what some of the methods are delayed feed-forward reaction, slowed reaction times, pain, weakness in both sets of muscles. The nutation, the inhibited muscles are weaker because they're inhibited. The nutation muscles, or excuse me, the counternutation muscles that are contracted, they are weaker because they're doing two things at once, holding the joint stable and then doing their given task. So we'll also have pain, we'll have disturbed motion patterns, apprehension about certain movements and giving way. So we have a person who's running and then all of a sudden they'll fall. Anyway, so this is all reinforced by a positive feedback loops that maintain this disability. The muscle systemic effects. Muscle has two ends. One end is attaching to the sacrum or innominate, the pelvis, and the other end attaches to some other structure. That structure then attaches to other muscles, etc., in a cascading effect. When we have a lesion, a sacroiliac nutation lesion, it follows that same cascading effect, but it causes structural framework to shift to avoid nutation on the injured side. So we will, because there's only two motions, and because there's only two motions, nutation and counternutation, more or less, we have predictable patterns in muscle activation and inhibition. And what I found is similar to what's been found by other researchers like Youngman and Yanda. Also, though, but what I show is the reasons why these are happening. And also I show the predictable patterns in posture and movements that occur with these muscle imbalances. Here's what happens. You have an imbalance between the contracted muscles, or on the side of injury, and the inhibited muscles. And you have another imbalance between that side and the opposite side. So what happens then is the pelvis will torque, the spine will twist, the extremities rotate, and the body moves in asymmetrical patterns. this affects the way the joints meet each other. And so you'll have dysfunction between the foot, knee, hip, spine, IVD, shoulders, etc. And this will cause more problems than the original injury. And it may remain indefinitely because the ligaments have a tendency to heal very slowly, if at all, especially once you're 35 years old. After that. So, what happened here? Oh, okay, here's my conclusion. The sacroiliac nutation lesion is believed to create ligamento muscular responses that may underlie many musculoskeletal dysfunctions throughout the body, including cranial disorders. Further research is needed to determine reliable and valid tools to assess this condition and investigate conservative treatment options to facilitate healing and limit any associated disability. In other words, prevention is stabilizing your SI joint. And this is real quickly, this is what I lectured on here today. This is my 30 years of research. I've developed what I call a mind map, what others call it too. This is structure. This is the muscles. Now I show a lot of the muscles how they create individual patterns that create nutation or counternutation. I haven't divided into there. This is the SI joint, and then application and treatment. So that's it. Thank you.
And by all means, go to Dr. Serola's website. He has all kinds of information about his research that he's presented, as well as much others.